change. We believe that through collective action, education, and dialogue, we can create safer environments for all. And it is only through our unwavering dedication to this cause that we can hope to put an end to this intimate act of violence and dangerous association with its friends. We are honored today to have a special guest today, Assembly Member Alex Lee, who shares our commitment to community safety and is actively working to make a difference in the legislative arena. In a moment, we will have the privilege of hearing from him about the importance of our collective efforts in the direction of this issue. So on behalf of Maitri, I'm extending our gratitude to all of you for joining us. Your presence signifies your dedication to the cause of ending intimate partner violence and making community safer. So without further ado, let us begin this important community session. Join me in welcoming Assembly Member Alex Lee to share his insights and perspectives on this critical matter. Thank you.
Okay, yes, that's good. Can everyone hear me? I think it's quite loud. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Assembly Member Alex Lee. I proudly represent this district in the state legislature. So I represent Berryessa, where I live, going all the way north into Alameda County, as north as Fremont and Sonoma. So I've represented this district since 2020. And today, I just wanted to thank Maitri for your incredible work supporting DV survivors and those impacted by domestic violence. And today I was asked to talk a little bit about gun violence and its intersection with domestic violence. And as you all probably are very well aware of, is that the United States stands singularly pride in the developed world in our gun violence. There's no other developed country in the world that is not in civil war that has more gun deaths than this country. And how can that be? We're the most powerful, we're the wealthiest, and most proud country in the world, and yet we have more people die to gun violence than any other place in the world. And that's because for most parts of this country, it's very, very easy to get a gun. So I'll take, for example, a state that's not in California, is that it's quite easy for even minors to walk into a Walmart and buy an AR-15 and tomorrow to shoot up their school. That's the truth. And there is a lot of power in the gun lobby to continue to have nonsensical laws, when even the most Americans support California-style universal background checks. Now in California, we're very proud to, especially being the most populous state in the nation, to have the lowest gun violence, especially for our population. And that's because we have a lot of common sense measures in place that I've been proud to support and strengthen across the time. So in California, if you were an adult and you wanted to buy a gun, all it would take, of course, is $500-600. You walk into a store, but you have to do a background check. You have to do a written test, which is 10 questions, very easy. And you have to wait 10 days. Now, remember, in the media, if you hear it all the time, and especially in the right-wing media, they will say that California has the most arcane and restrictive anti-gun laws in the country. But that is what we have. All we have is a background check that says whether or not you have a felony on record, whether or not you have enough money, and whether or not basically you can pass with a C grade on a 10 question quiz and wait 10 days. That is the strongest gun legislation safety system we have in the country. And if it shocks you, that's because it's pretty bad. In fact, we're actually the second strongest. Massachusetts is slightly stronger than us. But this is the low bar the country doesn't have. They don't have background checks, they don't have anything like that. But in California, we do have what's called the red flag laws. So if you believe that someone is a threat to your community, to yourself, you can report them and you can have law enforcement take away their firearms, their deadly firearms. And that law is actually very well implemented here in Santa Clara County, as opposed to other counties that don't enforce it as well. And why I talk about this a lot is because, unfortunately, domestic violence or anger between parties is quite quite common in this country, right? Although it's not common, although it's not unique to just this country, a lot of places in the world have people who are very angry, people who are very upset, right? But only in this country is it so easy that you can walk legally into a store and buy weapons that can kill people quite easily. So that's really, unfortunately, how our dynamic is. And California consistently tries to limit the prevalence of firearms and how easily people can retain them. So that's why we beef up our background check system. We limit the kind of firearms, especially weapons of war style weapons that you can acquire. And so we continue to do that kinds of things to make sure so that when someone has episodes or there is violence that occurs, it doesn't have to be of the mass violence and deadly kind of sort. And so it's really important to continue your work in advocacy and sharing the stories, because too often people rope in together that there is some God-given right that you have to have weapons and that no one else's life or safety matters at all, right? So that's why it's important to continue to have your advocacy, continue to fight for common sense change, because that's what we need in this country. And in California, you should be proud that even though the bar is relatively low, we still have the highest standards in the country, and that's what people in the rest of the country want. They want, at the very bare minimum, a title purchase to check whether or not you should be eligible to have a gun. That's as simple as that. So I really appreciate you all being here today. I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation about a lot of the important issues, and thanks again for inviting me up here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Lee, for inaugurating our event. Hadra will give a token of appreciation, thanking you for your words. Thank you. Alrighty, so I will move into introductions for our keynote speaker, Julia F. Weber. I'll provide a brief introduction and Ms. Julia will begin to speak. So Julia F. Weber has spent her career developing innovative approaches to solving complex issues facing families, children, and communities. She consults with national, state, and local agencies and government entities and regularly speaks on domestic violence, firearms violence prevention policies, child custody, and the implementation of promising practices to prevent violence. Julia has trained hundreds of judicial officers, court staff, attorneys, victim advocates, and mental health practitioners, and has drafted and successfully advocated for many firearm violence prevention policies with the focus on equity and inclusion, including the allocation of $40 million in California state funding for implementation of civil firearm prohibiting remedies. We are super honored to have her expertise here today, so now please give a hand to Julia.
Okay, well, hello everyone. Is it echoing? Can you hear me okay, or is it echoing over here? All right. I'm going to take you back a little bit to about 1940s, where we're looking at another time when we had a major public health crisis starting up. And at the same time, a public education campaign that was designed to create a certain kind of reliance on a product that was unsafe. So many of you, of course, are living through a time where smoking is way down. Let me go back here. Are we sure the sound's working? Because I'm going to try it. Let's see. No. All right, so we're going to sort of rework this because the sound is not working for the slide presentation. But no worries, there's plenty to cover. So this is a time in which most 80 years ago, the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company introduced a print and radio advertising campaign for its cigarettes. And one of the recordings that I had here was a radio ad talking about how healthy it was for you to smoke as much as possible, especially for your T-zone. Your T-zone was taste and throat. This is a time where they were arguing that it was better if you were pregnant to help with relaxation, to stay less anxious during the pregnancy, and pushing even Santa Claus promoting smoking. So his sort of ho, ho, ho of smoking there in the radio ad goes into more detail, citing the sort of personal right to smoke being grounded in our culture. We also know that we've seen a similar campaign to promote your health and safety by encouraging access to firearms. And you can see here an early ad that focuses on women. As customers, you're safer with a firearm. You also see here this idea that firearms can save your life. So it's very similar to this idea that we saw with the cigarette companies. And of course, over the course of time, we have fundamentally changed our relationship to smoking in this country, in part because of the recognition of the impact of smoking, not just on individuals, but the community at large, right? So we have much more limits in terms of smoking in public places. And even when we look back at this ad, you can see sort of similarities between this notion of an industry promoting healthy habits by ensuring that you are armed, similar to connecting you to smoking years ago. There was a saying that developed with Second Amendment enthusiasts and gun owners that God didn't make men and women equal, Colonel Colt did. Colt being the firearm manufacturer, still in business, responsible as one of the manufacturers of the AR-15, in particular the weapon that was used in 2018 at the Tree of Life shooting at the synagogue in Pennsylvania. They killed 11 people. This is not an easy topic, as was mentioned at the outset, and I work with survivors every day and with people whose loved ones, children, spouses, parents, friends didn't survive being shot. But one of my mentors, colleagues, heroes, former boss, I was with Giffords Law Center where I established the implementation program, is Gabby Giffords, herself a survivor of gun violence back in 2011 when she was doing Congress on Your Corner in Tucson, Arizona. I'm from Arizona, so Gabby also has a special place in my heart in terms of the Arizona connection, and was shot, declared dead, and made it. If you haven't seen the documentary, Won't Back Down, I highly recommend it. It's about Gabby and her husband, now Senator Mark Kelly, and their establishment of Giffords. So we know this is a difficult topic, and we know that many people in the room have personal experiences. So please take care of yourself as you're listening. We can make a difference, we can move forward, and I'm gonna hopefully give you some hope and reason to move forward collectively. So, as has already been mentioned by the Assembly member, firearm ownership is prevalent. This is a typical picture of many of our metropolitan areas in California. We have a lot of cars, right? We also have even more firearms. So more privately owned firearms than any other country, and far exceeding the number of cars. And we've seen a huge increase in firearm ownership, especially during the pandemic. One of the things I want to really highlight is that we are not talking about all firearm owners. Gabby Giffords, for example, and her husband, Senator Kelly, are firearm owners. I work closely with folks who own firearms If you're in the service profession, you should assume you are working with people who have access to firearms. But we're talking about people who may be at risk of harming themselves or others because of the access they have to firearms, and who we as a society generally believe should not have that kind of irresponsible access. So right now, 4 in 10 US adults say they live in a household with a gun, including 30% who say they personally own one. In California, we believe about 4.2 million people or more own firearms, and about an additional 3.1 million live in homes with someone else who owns a firearm. What's the number one reason people own firearms? Personal protection. And since we're talking about the intersection of domestic violence or dating violence and firearm, that's particularly important, because the idea that you are safer with a firearm when you are experiencing family violence, domestic violence, intimate partner abuse has no foundation. Okay? It doesn't stop the industry from telling us that you are somehow safer with a firearm, but we have to arm ourselves with the knowledge, with the information about what the truth is in this area. We also know that firearms are connected to a variety of lethal outcomes and injuries and trauma. This is a memorial that Gifford set up a couple of years ago, showing the over 3,400 people who died as a result of gun violence in 2020. This was in San Francisco. This is for those who died in California during 2020. I think what's even more interesting in terms of really looking at the data and the impact is not only the loss of life, but the number of people in California who have had what we call an EV. That's an experience of violence that Dr. Garen Winton-Mute out of UC Davis talks about. The majority of Californians have some experience of looking at a sidewalk memorial, hearing gunshots, losing someone to a violent incident involving firearms. And we know that too many of these folks are also young people who should be in a position to be developing confidence in their community and in their institutions, and are instead living with fear. The industry specifically focuses on building a customer base. Similar to the smoking industry, the tobacco industry, Big Tobacco had to produce a set of customers, of clients, consumers who will purchase the cigarettes. Similarly, we have the industry developing things like the JR-15, which is a AR-15 style weapon designed for children, for young people. And it's one of the things that we've been litigating around, and the governor's been concerned about here in California, is the messaging that goes with this kind of outreach to young people. Now, the argument that the industry makes is that it helps inform young people, making them safer and understanding how to use firearms. But there's no question that it also makes it look appealing, that you're somehow going to have fun, be empowered by having firearms. And we see this similar kind of push for women owning firearms in contemporary advertising. So in 2021, 5.4 million people purchased firearms for the first time, and more than 33% of those purchasing firearms were women. So this brought over 1 million women into gun ownership during that time. And the National Sports Shooting Foundation, which is sort of the NRA of today, I would argue. They reported a 77% rise in female gun ownership between 2005 and 2020. So I spent a lot of time training judges and people who work on child custody cases directly with families. And it's really important to understand that the myth of a gun owner only being male and involved with criminal activity, those are assumptions that we have to push by the wayside. Many victims of domestic violence have been convinced that they should become firearm owners to protect themselves. And yet, we know that it's not as this, you can see the advertisement, right? There's this sense that you are going to be harmed by a stranger, right? That being concerned about sexual assault or other types of assault, that you're most vulnerable outside your home. But all the research contradicts that notion for women. In 2022, the last year that I currently have numbers for, around 48,800 women and girls were killed by someone they knew in their own family, which is more than 5 women or girls every hour. In 2018, 92% of intimate partner female homicides in the US were committed by a man the victim knew, and 63% were committed by husbands. So we need to have at least a basic understanding of domestic violence for today's conversation, and I know many of you do. You are engaged in important work in this area. The whole area of domestic violence is quite complicated, and there are multiple definitions. The one that I use the most, that I find most comprehensive, is one developed by a woman named Barbara Hart, who was a leader in the battered women's movement in the 1970s that led to some of the earliest firearm prohibitions. So the assembly member mentioned red flag laws, what we call gun violence restraining orders in California. Those are actually the least protective firearm prohibiting remedy we have in California. Because in California, we have had domestic violence, firearm prohibitions in place long before the rest of the country. And I'll go into some more detail about that. But we need to have them because of the intersection of domestic violence, access to firearms, and dangerousness. So what is it about domestic violence that makes it so dangerous? This is a quick domestic violence 101, as we say. First of all, domestic violence generally includes rules and a rule maker. That's pretty consistent across all the various ways that domestic violence is perpetrated. The first rule is I get to make the rules. That's the person who is exerting the power and control in the relationship. The rule maker, the perpetrator, the batterer, the person who's doing harm. The next rule they usually have is there will be no separation. You cannot leave, which is a form of what we call in the law false imprisonment, keeping somebody captive under your control. The next rule is you can't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone about what I've done, what's going on in our relationship. And the next most common rule is be loyal. So when you see these rules in place and you imagine someone trying to get a domestic violence restraining order, or just leave the relationship, or telling someone who's a service provider or an advocate, you can see they've broken just about every one of the rules, which is one of the reasons domestic violence is so dangerous, because The thing that keeps all of these rules in place is the threat or actual use of physical, emotional, sexual, financial, psychological abuse, and actual violence. When you introduce firearms into that situation, we know how much more dangerous the situation becomes. So we have 4.5 million women in the U.S. who have been threatened with a firearm. The presence of a firearm, regardless of who owns it, increases the risk of a lethal outcome when a man is perpetrating domestic violence and a woman is the victim, increases the risk of her dying by the use of that firearm by 500%. And there's the ongoing threat. Having done family law work for 25 plus years, I can tell you many of the cases just involved pointing to the firearm on the table, pointing to the safe, cleaning the firearm, never pulling it out and pointing it at the victim, but just knowing that the firearm was there to reinforce the message is a form of violence that's associated with easy access to firearms. Now, we hear a lot about the tragedy, the horrific tragedy of mass shootings, including children who have lost their lives just going to school. One of the things that I don't think gets enough attention is how often children are harmed in the context of their own family. So domestic violence impacts children and youth within the context of their own family. We're talking about in 2022, just some more statistics, at least 866 kids ages 17 and younger were shot in domestic violence situations. 621 of them died. At the same time, 268 children were shot at school, 75 of them fatally. Horrific. Any loss of life, any harm and trauma that's resulting from easy access to firearms is completely intolerable. And we have to draw attention to this lesser known area where children are being harmed and unsafe in their own home. We also know that domestic violence isn't always taken seriously as a dangerous phenomenon. We spent decades treating it as a private matter to be resolved between the couple with separation, mediation, low intervention from the state. There's some advantages to that in the sense that people are often embarrassed and afraid, and advocates really push us to understand that survivors need to drive and shape the remedy. We can't just say state intervention is the best way to go. But when we don't take reported domestic violence seriously, the results can be deadly. And we see that with over 2/3 of mass shootings having some connection to domestic violence. So the Pulse nightclub incident, for example, his former partner talked about the level of violence and abuse she was subjected to. So over 2/3 of mass shootings connected to domestic violence means we have to do more to take domestic violence seriously, not only to protect that individual victim, children and family members in the household, but the community more broadly. Similarly, what we're here today to talk about is the level of teen dating violence. So if we're looking at a statistic like 1 in 12 teens experience domestic violence, we have to say no to that and respond appropriately. We also know that when we're talking about homicide and dating partners, dating puts you in a higher risk category because of half of all intimate partner homicides are committed by dating partners. But here's the good news on the same slide. There's something we can do about this. The right policies, research shows, decreases the risk of homicide and domestic violence cases involving firearms by 16%. So we gotta have the right tool in our toolkits. And we have them in California. And there's a lot of them. We have incredible remedies that are designed to specifically address firearms and domestic violence. I'm going to start first, this part, with the federal policies. So under federal law, there are a bunch of ways you can become prohibited from having a firearm: having, possessing, owning, purchasing a firearm. And that's under the Gun Control Act. And we'll get a little bit legally nerdy here. But 18 U.S.C. 922G is the section that tells us who can't have a firearm. And I've highlighted in yellow those sections of 18 U.S.C. 922G that deal with domestic violence. So if you're convicted of a felony, you're prohibited for life. A felony, not just involving domestic violence, but any type of felony. So in some instances, we're looking at people who will never regain access to their firearm. And that felony could have been a violent felony or a non-violent felony. If you're a fugitive from justice, if you are someone who has been discharged from the military, under not good circumstances, controlled substances. There's archaic and biased language in the code that talks about being a mental defective. Generally, that's referring to people who we would think of as being admitted to a mental health facility and kept and evaluated for 72 hours. Someone who is illegally in this country, again, archaic, biased language, describing them as illegal aliens. If you've renounced your citizenship. And then the next two are domestic violence focused, specifically under federal law. G8 says you're prohibited from having firearms and ammunition if you have a restraining order in place against you. And G9 is you are prohibited if there is a misdemeanor domestic violence case against you. The misdemeanor domestic violence case is a prohibition for life, and the restraining order prohibition is while that's in place. So this is getting a lot of attention right now because we have a U.S. Supreme Court case that was heard in November, and I was part of a group of people that petitioned the Supreme Court to hear this case. It's U.S. versus Rahimi. And Mr. Rahimi is the defendant in Texas who agreed to a civil restraining order with a woman with whom he shared a child. That made it a qualifying restraining order under federal law, and he became prohibited from having firearms. Unfortunately, there was no follow-up, no relinquishment effort, no attempt to ensure he complied, and he kept those firearms despite being prohibited. Eventually, he went around Arlington, Texas, shooting up the town, a Whataburger restaurant, a constable's car, a car accident scene, and for that, he was arrested. So he wasn't arrested or charged for domestic violence. He wasn't prosecuted for domestic violence at any point. He was prosecuted and convicted of having a firearm when he wasn't allowed to because of the restraining order. So he eventually appealed his conviction. His conviction is more robust than just this one issue, but he appealed his conviction on the domestic violence restraining order violation, and the Fifth Circuit overturned his conviction. A 3-judge panel said, yeah, there's no constitutional basis for Congress to be prohibiting people with restraining orders from having a firearm because it's not grounded in the history and tradition of the U.S. We don't see enough of a basis to historically ground this prohibition under 18 U.S.C., and they overturned that part of his conviction. He's still in prison under the other convictions. And that's what's being appealed. We're asking the U.S. Supreme Court to determine whether or not Congress has the ability to restrict access to firearms when someone has a domestic violence restraining order against him. I put this up here because this is a letter Mr. Rahimi wrote from prison. And one of the things he says about why he has the firearm is to protect his family. Okay? He's prohibited because he harmed his family. He engaged in the perpetration of domestic violence, and yet this kind of argument resonates so significantly in U.S. culture that he's trying to make this argument that how could you take away my firearm when all I'm trying to do is protect my family and I have a right to keep a firearm in my home. We need to understand that that is the argument that's being made, which again sort of subordinates the experience of survivors of the domestic violence he was perpetrating. Now, the assembly member mentioned California being a leader in the area of gun violence prevention. Giffords, Everytown, other organizations monitor all of the state laws. California is rated by Giffords on their scorecard. They get an A grade, and we all want A's. Why does California get an A? 30 years ago, California was one of the murder capitals of the United States. The trajectory, the reality of gun violence in California was very similar to what is continuing to happen in other parts of the country. But we made an investment after the 101 California shooting, which was a shooting in San Francisco at a law firm where someone I knew was killed, one of the attorneys. We made a commitment. Family members, survivors, started a nonprofit, which is now the Giffords Law Center, focusing on changing the policies in California. And over 100,000 lives would have been saved nationally if the rest of the country adopted similar policies. So for example, we're not just talking about a handful of policy, but the tools we have in our toolkit include background checks and firearm prohibiting remedies specifically for domestic violence. We don't have to rely on the gun violence restraining order in domestic violence cases, because domestic violence cases that may require a restraining order also include protecting a named party and household members and firearm relinquishment procedures. So I was part of a team that advocated for SB 320. I was one of the drafters, and I'm very proud of what has happened since this law was adopted. Santa Clara County is one of the leaders in this area. What it means is that in domestic violence civil restraining order cases in California, we don't do what happened with Mr. Rahimi's case. We follow up. You have to turn in evidence that you've complied and gotten rid of your firearms by storing or selling them. And if you don't demonstrate that, the court's required to report that information to law enforcement and prosecutors. Before all of that happens, one of the things I am most proud of that we do in California is you get information about how to comply. And that sounds super simple, but what we have seen since we've implemented this law is San Mateo County just reported triple the number of firearms and proofs of compliance that have been provided since they've been providing this information. Orange County has collected over 460 firearms since July, and the court doesn't have them, but they have collected the proof that those firearms have been stored or sold to law enforcement or with a gun dealer. We've made a huge difference. This is the kind of law and policy that can change the experience of dating partners, spouses, family members, and our larger community. For youth in particular, I wanted to highlight this really important public education campaign. Unfortunately, the sound doesn't work, but we have a little video here that's on the website, so you can check it out. SNUG stands for Safer Not Using Guns, and it's geared towards youth sharing their experience with firearms, and you can watch the video with her if you go to the website. We're talking about not just homicide or risks associated with dating partners and domestic violence, which I know is our focus today, but suicide, unintentional shootings, and community violence are all a part of what SNUG is focused on. So check that out, and there's a lot of good material there and videos to share in training and in your community. We also want to make sure that anyone doing any kind of service provision in the healthcare field, I train lawyers on this, mediators and social workers, to have conversation just as you would about any other public health issue. Many of those folks will talk about toddlers having access to unsafe situations in the home. You'll talk about the car seat needing to be secure. When you go see your physician, they may talk to you about what you need to do to stay healthy. We want to be having those same conversations, assuming that people have too easy access to firearms. So we recommend just being very direct and honest about it, building that rapport so that people have the opportunity to do the right thing. And responsible firearm owners are very supportive of this approach. I've also brought with me pocket-sized brochures that are in English, Spanish, and simplified Chinese characters that Giffords has produced. Again, instead of highlighting one remedy, because restraining orders aren't always the answer. Arrest isn't always the answer. Sometimes it's a mental health facility or supportive program. Sometimes it's working in a community a relationship building or mediation process. Having access to these brochures can make a huge difference. So I want to wrap up here and give our youth speakers a chance to weigh in and hear from you as audience members, and leave you with the words of my mentor, friend, colleague, Gabby Giffords. Be courageous. We can do this together. Be bold, be courageous, and thank you for your attention.
Alrighty, thank you so much for that presentation, Julia. Everyone please give another round of applause. Wonderful. Okay, yes, so now I'll welcome our student speakers. Unfortunately, one of our student speakers, Kal Lakshmi, was sick and won't be speaking today. And as we continue with the student panel, just a reminder that we will be sharing this video widely with our sister agencies and communities members. So it's awesome to have everyone's continued and utmost attention. And now I'll introduce our first speaker, Shrisha Gulial. So I will give a brief bio and let her begin. So Shrisha is a sophomore at Valley Christian High School in San Jose. and she is a member of her school's South Asian Club and Mock Trial Club, and also assists in coaching Kung Fu and has been pursuing dance as a passion. So now everyone, please give a hand for Trisha.
Hello. So I would. Hi. I would like to applaud Maitri for hosting its youth convention to commemorate teenage dating gun violence, and it is my privilege to speak on the concerns and consequences of teenage dating gun violence. There has been an alarming rise of teens reporting dating violence. Teenage dating violence is a subset of intimate partner violence, which refers to the abusive and aggressive behavior, verbal, physical, sexual, emotional, economic, and psychological, in dating relationships among teens to frighten, manipulate, humiliate, blame, and injure the partner to gain domination or control. Irrespective of gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, or sexual orientation, dating abuse and violence is disturbingly common among adolescents and young adults aged between 10 to 18. As we know, gun violence is a uniquely lethal problem in the United States, and the teenage dating relationship has not been affected by it. Usual perception is that teen dating violence is less serious than violence among adult partners, as dating teens are probably not living together. However, it is a disturbing fact that gun violence occurs among dating teens too. Although a person under 18 is not allowed to purchase or own firearms, their parents can. Availability and accessibility to firearms can escalate violence to lethal levels even among teens. A new study published by JAMA Pediatrics confirms the occurrence of dating homicide among teens, in which 90% victims are girls, and most common used weapon was a gun. The researchers examined 2,188 homicides of young people 11 to 18 years old, in which the victim knew the perpetrator. Of these homicides, 150, 6.9%, were classified as intimate partner homicides. The findings showed that majority of the homicides occur in older adolescents between the ages of 16 and 18. A common trigger is ending the relationship and the jealousy of a victim finding someone new. In some cases, there might be conflict, betrayal, or severe altercation or argument that ends in death by firearm. There are serious consequences of gun violence. It is important to know that the access of gun is the key component in gun violence incidents. Presence of firearm raises risk of accidental or intentional injury and death, including suicide. Even if initially guns or firearms are there to just threaten or intimidate, too often it ends tragically in homicide. The pernicious impacts of lives lost in gun violence are felt by the immediate family, community, and society at large. The intensity of pain and anguish that families of deceased victims endure throughout their lives cannot be expressed. The repercussions of gun violence exposure and trauma it creates persist lifelong and over generations. Presence of guns puts the safety of vulnerable partners at risk and entails fear and panic, which damages self-confidence in the victim. It renders the vulnerable partner powerless, helpless, and anxious, which in turn negatively impacts their physical and mental well-being. It also influences many aspects of functioning, like low performance in school, job, or any activity. Scholars have noted depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, self-injurious behavior, substance abuse, multiple levels of fear, trust issues as a result of victimization among gun violence abuse among survivors. Researchers also show significant links between suicidal ideation, completed suicides, and adolescent dating violence. It is important to realize that teen dating gun violence is a serious problem impacting millions of youth globally. In school and community settings, it is crucial to build teen awareness about healthy communication skills in relationships, consent, safer sex, and to identify red flags. There is dearth of research on the way gun interacts in teen dating violence, so research on the risk factors is much needed to create comprehensive prevention and intervention programs. Restrictions on purchase and possession of firearms needs to strengthen. The current federal law does not prohibit abusing dating partners from possessing guns. This exclusion of abusive dating partners from firearms restriction is deadly. Many organizations have been calling on lawmakers to close the boyfriend loophole, which will prevent domestic abusers from accessing guns. In the end, I hope that concerted efforts at home, school, community, state, and federal level are made for advocacy, informed research, and stringent laws to curb gun violence.
All right, thank you so much, Trisha, for your speech. Everyone, please give one more round of applause. Alrighty, and now I'll introduce our next student speaker, Rahul Ray. So Rahul is a sophomore attending Piedmont Hills High School in San Jose. He is the school's debate club vice president, Model UN's publicist, and a coach for HIGS Quiz Bowl, and a first-degree black belt in martial arts. Rahul volunteers for Maitri's prevention program. So now, let's welcome Rahul.
Good afternoon. My name is Rahul Ray, and today I'll be talking about a wide range of topics, but mainly it's about misconceptions and causes, and to some degree, the prevention of gun violence. Before I start, I'd like to thank Maitri for giving me the opportunity to speak here today, as well as other youth members and community members, because it's really important for us to voice our opinions on a wide platform like this. Before I start, can I ask, do we have any NRA members in the house? No? Okay, because I think that it's really important to hear other perspectives, and all of us have to work together to voice our opinions so we can come together and forge a solution we can all agree on. No? With so many different viewpoints and perspectives like the gun crisis. So misconceptions. Let's talk about a really big one that's personal to me. It's the misconception that media can directly incite gun violence. You've heard it before. Video games are causing violence in our communities. It's only partially true. Take it from a survivor of Columbine, who, when he was asked about the circumstances, said that he believed that video games may have been a factor, but in no way were a direct cause of the shooting. Because with Columbine and so many other shootings, you have more severe underlying causes like bullying, you have mental health, abuse, substance abuse, radicalization, and so many other issues that are to blame, and video games are just an external factor that can only amplify those real concerns. Video games can only really incite violence in two cases. One, where the consumer is not very mentally stable, or two, if it's a child, because children are very young and impressionable and can be easily influenced by media. And that really comes down to parenting responsibility. Parents have to be responsible for what their children consume. Otherwise, they're not really accountable for parenting. They're not doing their job. And it comes down to parents taking responsibility for their children. The other misconception I want to talk about is that we need to take away everyone's guns. I'm not saying that, because there are a lot of legitimate reasons to legally own a firearm. Shooting is a sport. It can also be used for hunting, and I think most importantly, self-defense. There are legitimate reasons to own a firearm. A lot of home invasions have been stopped because someone owned a handgun. In Texas a couple of years ago, a mass shooting was averted in a mall because someone responsibly owned a firearm and was able to stop the crime. So there are reasons. And don't just take it from me. Look at Iceland. Iceland's a country with a lot of guns per capita, comparable to the US for its size, but has such little gun crime because regulation in that country is so well enforced. And I'll talk about regulation in a bit, but let's talk about some real causes. Number one, of course, is mental health. The WHO cites it as the leading cause of youth violence globally, and and that includes gun violence in America. Mental health is connected to things like abuse, bullying, and substance abuse, and all of those are factors that need to be destigmatized and looked at, especially among youth, because they're very prone to violence in those circumstances. Another really important cause of gun violence is PTSD. I'm lumping that differently from just general mental health because it disproportionately affects a lot of people in the veteran community. Combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder has affected a lot of people, and they've clearly shown these symptoms. They should be diagnosed, but because of how lax gun laws are nationally, they're allowed to own firearms, which makes them a danger to themselves and others. The most famous example is in 2013, a Marine veteran who very clearly was displaying signs of emotional and psychological distress was allowed to own a handgun. And because of that ownership of a firearm, which he shouldn't have had, he was able to shoot former Navy SEAL Chris Kyle and his friend during an intervention. And that really leads into my point about regulation. Who should have firearms and what firearms should they have? Just nationally speaking, I really think we need universal background checks because laws in this country are so loose that people who have restraining orders against them, people who have criminal records, diagnosed psychological conditions, there's so many workarounds for them to allow them to purchase firearms that makes them dangerous to themselves and others in their communities. Just taking the general point of this convention into partner violence, people who have restraining orders filed against them are still, in some states, able to purchase firearms. There's so many loopholes and so much wiggle room in the legislation that they can purchase firearms and end up engaging in domestic violence with that firearm. It's scary to think about, but it happens. There's such little regulation with who can purchase firearms that it makes them dangerous to themselves and others in their communities and relationships. And the other point I'll talk about is what should be legal, because right to bear arms is a very vague term, and I think we need to draw a line of what defines a constitutionally ownable arm. Because I think assault weapons is where the line has to be drawn. Because I'm opening the floor here. Can anyone give me a legitimate reason to own an assault weapon, like an AR-15? Anyone? That's what I thought, because there isn't one. It's not a hunting rifle, it's not a sport rifle, even for home defense. Just here, I'm quoting my history teacher, who is a former Marine. He told me that for defending your home, you would never use an assault rifle. You'd use a handgun. And again, assault rifles, there's no legitimate reason. People own assault weapons because they want to own assault weapons. There's no legal application. The same thing goes for things like high-capacity magazines or bump stocks or ghost guns. These things shouldn't be legal, but because of how loose our legislation is and how vague the Constitution is, people can own them, and they end up being used in crimes like the 2017 Las Vegas shooting, where bump stocks were employed. Again, I think that assault weapons should be criminalized because those things have no real civilian application and unfortunately end up being used disproportionately in mass shootings and other forms of crime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raul. Everyone, please give one more hand for Raul. Alrighty, so thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists here for speaking today. So as of right now, we want to engage in a dynamic Q&A session with our keynote speaker and our youth student speakers. So we'll just go by a raise of a hands here if anyone would like to ask a question or share their thoughts to our speakers. And please don't be shy, it's a safe environment. Anyone else with any questions they'd like to ask?
how do we meet in the middle? How do we overcome what seem to be polarized positions in this space, if that's okay, if I interpret it that way? There are a few things. First of all, one of the reasons I started with the smoking, the push for smoking, is that it really was a deep-seated belief that it was a personal right. And this is, I mean, for some of you, I may seem ancient, as one of my kids' friends called his grandmother a few years ago. She's ancient, he said. While it may seem that way, I graduated from law school in 1994, and one of the essays that we were asked to opine on, or we were supposed to develop, was an argument around how smoking was a form of assault, secondhand smoke, because of how it impacted your lungs if you're in an elevator with someone, or for those of you who may not recall when we could smoke on airplanes and somehow it was at the back of the airplane as if we were all breathing different air, right? So it wasn't that long ago that we still had this idea that it was such an individual right, grounded in the personal liberties and freedom that we should be afforded in the United States. And we had to launch a significant campaign starting largely in the 60s and beyond, pointing out that it was not just a personal choice, that it had community implications, and there were costs and health consequences of having no regulation or information available around those risks, and pushing it for children, pushing pregnant women to smoke, and so forth. So I think we have to have more of a public education campaign to understand the risks associated with firearms, to counteract the notion that you're safer with a firearm. Certainly there are a handful of examples where a firearm in self-defense may have made a difference, but more often than not, there's harm that occurs as a result of easy access to firearms, whether it's unintentional shootings or being used in a domestic violence homicide or to threaten, abuse, and so forth. So we need to counteract the messaging coming out of the industry. And I think it's important to note that the majority of people in the United States, including gun owners, support and appreciate common sense gun laws. So we have to have that less recognized majority become better recognized, and to ensure that our leaders who are elected, who are voting on these policies, have good information, understand who they represent and what the people of the United States ultimately want. And those of us who are not firearm owners, I don't own a firearm, but as we say, some of my best friends own firearms. We have to be able to have those conversations and not be biased. Responsible gun owners are allies and supporters of common sense gun laws, and if we vilify them and we don't talk honestly about how prevalent gun ownership is, we shut down the conversation. And similarly, not everyone who's concerned about gun violence prevention is a so-called gun grabber. We are reasonable people who are trying to prevent and address a major public health crisis. So I think there are lots of opportunities to sit down with gun owners. The major gun violence prevention organizations nationally have a gun owners coalition. So we are working with gun owners, we're working with veterans who have guns, police officers who need guns as part of their work. And what we're talking about is under what circumstances should we restrict access? What should those, as you talked about, under what circumstances should we be regulating the type of firearm and who has access to those firearms? Which is a common sense public health approach, the same way we don't just let drunk folks drive, or we don't let you drive without a seatbelt, or in California, a helmet when you're on a motorcycle. These are public health issues. I don't know if you want to add.
What I just want to add is that there's a lot of different and conflicting viewpoints. I mean, I don't personally agree with everything Ms. Weber is saying, but I agree with a lot of what she's saying as well, especially the part about easy access. I think that you have people on one spectrum saying that we need to get rid of guns completely, and you have people on another spectrum saying things like we need to give teachers guns. And I think that both sides are really extreme, and you have to look at the center, you have to look at the middle and find middle ground. I think that there are reasons to own firearms, but like Ms. Weber said, there has to be control on who can access it and why is it so easy? It can't be that easy to buy a gun, and we need more states to imitate laws like California and be more tough on access to guns, because I think that when you have a free-for-all like this country where it's so easy to purchase a firearm, it's just so dangerous. You know what I'm saying? It's like everyone really can buy a firearm in other states, because if you look at the Supreme Court case, for example, like in Texas, there's no enforcement of those laws. And I think that we need more strict laws that can restrict gun ownership, but at the same time, they don't punish responsible owners who follow the law. They abide by all these different mandates they're supposed to follow. I hope that answers your question.
So an excellent question. It was about whether or not discussion of increasing the cost of firearms and possibly ammunition, for example. I'll add that, but adding tax or otherwise controlling the economic marketplace in a way that would make firearms so expensive that it would limit access that way. So that's absolutely part of the conversation. In California, we also enacted AB 28 last year, or effective January 1st, that it adds an excise tax to ammunition purchases. So it has increased the cost of ammunition. And the proceeds from that excise tax all go to gun violence prevention efforts. So it's what's called a waterfall effect. So that if a certain millions of dollars is raised that way, it goes to this set of folks and then on down the line. So for example, the courts, law enforcement, and domestic violence for our purposes today, domestic violence firearms relinquishment is on the list and is anticipated to get about $15 million a year from an excise tax on ammunition. Now, one of the things that is part of the conversation is if you make it so expensive, how does that work in terms of the underground market, right? So, we're always trying to figure out, especially now as we've seen an increase in so-called ghost guns or unserialized firearms that are not registered. In California, we have a registry. So if you're a legal gun owner, your firearms are supposed to be registered, and the Department of Justice, the State Department of Justice, has a list called the Automated Firearms System, or AFS. So that's a list of people who legally own the firearms that they're associated with. We also have a database called CARPOS, which lists the people who have become prohibited. So you're prohibited because of a restraining order, a domestic violence restraining order, a workplace violence restraining order, civil harassment, elder abuse, school violence prevention order, or a gun violence restraining order. Those are the civil prohibitions in California. We also have criminal prohibitions. So if you're prohibited, you're going to be listed there. And then every day those two systems ping each other and they create a new database called the Armed Prohibited Person System, or APS. Those are people who are known to own firearms because they're in AFS and have become prohibited and haven't gotten rid of their firearms. So they're non-compliant. We have about 24,000 people in that database right now in California. If you properly store or sell your firearm, you'll still be in car posts, but you won't be in AFS because you no longer have firearms, and you won't be in apps. So part of what SB 320 is designed to do is to reduce the number of people in apps. And we have a bill right now, SB 899, that would expand those provisions across civil restraining orders. So we know that in criminal gun cases, it looks as though unserialized so-called ghost guns are accounting for anywhere from 30 to 50% of the firearms that are being obtained at a crime scene. That's really concerning, and so that's part of the conversation, is that how you increase the price, but also, and take some tax benefit back to public health prevention, while at the same time not pushing the entire industry underground so that there's no regulation, which is very hard to do given how easy it is to purchase online and ship firearms across state lines. Another area of tax reform or violence prevention efforts involving taxation is incentives for storing your firearms. So for example, we are looking at policies that would give a dealer some tax incentive if they would take firearms because someone was voluntarily storing them. During a move, when grandchildren are coming to visit, because there's a suicidal crisis, because of concerns about domestic violence, divorce, child custody, some other kind of mental health crisis, having more places to store your firearms, can we create an incentive through taxation credits, through tax credits? So all of that's on the table. Anyone? I'm happy to start, and then happy to have you all chime in. But another great question about what do we do to address the situation, for example, in Oxford, in Michigan, where yes, the parents were charged and convicted after a mass shooting threat after a mass shooting. And there are a few things that we need to be thinking about. First of all, for those of you who might be thinking about going to law school, I encourage it. I'm a happy lawyer who works on, absolutely horrific policy areas, but I have seen the power of being a well-informed advocate and the difference that these policies make and how life-saving they are. I'm also a proud social worker, so if you're thinking about an MSW, it's another way to get into policy work. But we need prosecutors who will take existing laws seriously. So this is my sort of pet project, which is to get implementation to be something that people focus on, because advocacy is critical, and we need the enthusiasm of community organizing to develop advocates, to have policies that inform gun owners about risks, provide incentives for safe storage at home. So in California, we have DOJ-approved ways of storing your firearm, which is one of the ways that we can do prevention, that you are expected to store your firearm appropriately and not allow your children to have access, except under certain circumstances. The violation of that law is inconsistently prosecuted, sometimes not at all. We are also concerned about bias prosecution, insofar as who's perceived as dangerous and who's held responsible and who isn't. The Michigan case stood out, got a lot of attention. There's also the case of the first grader in Newport News, Virginia, who shot his first grade teacher, and that mother was held responsible, even though there had been various efforts to try and address the first grader's behavior. She said she stored it out of reach. She has lost custody of her child. She's serving multiple years in prison related to that situation. She is a woman of color. I think there's reason to believe she was also a victim of domestic violence. Lots of concerns about overreaching as well, because children of various ages may engage in behavior that parents have limited control over. At the same time, adults who are gun owners need to be responsible. And there was enough evidence in the Michigan case that they had information about the risks that this child, this young person, the risky behavior. But we need to make sure people know about this and take it seriously. This isn't just empty threats when there's the availability of firearms. So if you're a firearm owner, you're concerned about mental health of your young person in your house, similar to what happened in UC Santa Barbara years ago that led to the adoption of the gun violence restraining order. The parents were concerned, the therapist was concerned, and it was believed that there was very little that they could do without that kind of remedy. So I argue for incentives to store information about what you are expected to do, and then appropriate follow-up and implementation of those restrictions so that we can prevent the kind of outcomes in Michigan and elsewhere. Do you want to add anything?
I think with parents and negligence, we have to go back to what Councilmember Lee said about that 10-question test in California. That's only in California too, not even nationwide. I think that it's about education on responsible gun ownership, because you have a lot of parents who just don't store their guns properly. They keep magazines inserted, they don't use gun safes, they keep safeties off. And all these things just make it even more tragic, because it's preventable when a child engages with that weapon, even by accident. And I think that 10-question test, for one, it should be standardized nationally. It shouldn't just be California. And I think also it should be more comprehensive. It should have more things about actual gun safety. I think if someone wants to get a gun license, we need proper gun education as well. Responsible storage, responsible usage, things like that. Because otherwise, if you have irresponsible gun owners who put others at risk because of their mismanagement and mishandling of the firearm, and especially with parents, it's just terrible to see because they don't properly store or manage their firearm, and it ends up endangering children in their homes.
We believe there's over 4.6 million children living in homes with guns that are not properly stored. That is, that they're stored unlocked and loaded. And so part of it is everybody who interacts with families, faith leaders, school leaders, people providing services, pediatricians, internists, anyone who's working with family members to have those conversations. How safe is your home? How safe are your firearms? And take the kinds of threats and risks that we saw in Michigan and elsewhere seriously so that people understand. The survivors I work with two mothers who horrifically lost their children. One of them was Wyland Gomes, he was 10 years old. The other one is Pierce, who both of these kids were each shot and killed by their fathers during a contested child custody case. And what the moms say is that they had lawyers, they worked with mental health practitioners, and nobody really talked to them about how possible it was, because these men had access to firearms and had demonstrated risky behavior that in retrospect they got information about. But they wish that they had been told, this isn't just that your ex-husband is behaving badly, but he is paranoid, hallucinating, making suicidal threats, making threats about harm to the child and to you, all of which, when you have access to firearms, puts you all at extraordinary risk. And nobody elevated the significance of those cases for those moms such that they could do more to lower the risk. And that's a horrific thing for them to have to live with, but they are speaking out and encouraging us all to take those kinds of threats more seriously and to prevent access to firearms when somebody's engaging in those kinds of behaviors.
Yeah, just 2 more questions.
So, I feel a lot of people still are living in a bubble where they don't know anyone that owns a gun or have not yet been affected by it. It's just a matter of time, honestly. And as a result of this, it's not top of mind unless there's a mass shooting. And even then, people are getting desensitized because it's happening so often. And not just that, but nothing seems to be done about it. So how do we make discussions around gun violence more commonplace and more urgent than it is right now?
Another great question, and it's a very hard to impress upon people a negative. That is, I'm aware of mass shootings and suicides and unintentional shootings that have been prevented because people are doing the right thing, right? So that doesn't get as much coverage, and it's one of the reasons, because it's hard to tell those stories, so it's one of the reasons I highlight those policies that you see a 16% reduction in domestic violence homicide when you implement policies that can prevent firearm and domestic violence tragic outcomes. So we can make a difference, the policies make a difference, the reports now coming out of the Department of Justice here in California, the Gun Violence Prevention Office under Attorney General Monta, also tell us that story about the over 100,000 lives that would have been saved if other states and the federal government had policies similar to California. So we know what works, but we have to adopt the policies and we have to implement them. So my sense is that helping to elevate it is a public health issue. Many people didn't know somebody who smoked, but they should be aware of the risks to themselves. And so the more we can highlight that in a responsible way, because what I don't want to have happen is blaming domestic violence victims and survivors for community violence. That's a very important unintended consequence that can happen, where we take away victim or survivor agency because we say, no, if you're not going to get a restraining order, I'm concerned about what this perpetrator might do in the community, so we're going to make a decision for you. Can't do that. We have to be very careful. The survivors, the victims often know what works best for themselves, and by working with them, we can reduce risk for them as well as for the community. But we have to make sure they're getting good information, and we have to make sure, just as people are concerned about, toddlers sticking their fingers in a light socket or not being restrained properly in a car seat, people may not know about the risks. And Brady has put out excellent information. There's a whole campaign about how parents can have conversations with other parents before their child goes over to another home. Do you have firearms in the home? How are you storing them? The same way you would about, I don't expect you to be driving and drinking or using drugs and so forth. So we need to just make that part of the way we interact with each other, so long as firearms are as available as they are.
All right, before we continue the questions, just a reminder that we have refreshments in the back, so feel free to grab them whenever you'd like. But are there any final questions that anyone would like to ask? We'll use the mic for the video.
Thank you so much for this. Actually, my question is a continuation of the question that was just asked. We are from the Cupertino School District, and last week there were threats in the school for gun, that somebody's going to come shooting, and so every single day a different school was targeted, and then they would call back and say it's a prank call. So this has become so kind of, we're on the fence, like I'm sending my kid to school knowing this, so you get a call in the morning that there is, there's going to be cops in the school because the school has received this thing but we'll keep you informed, and then they keep us informed. But I don't know what to do with this, right? Like, I did send my son to school. He had left and I saw the message come, then I texted him. I'm like, hey, cops are going to be in the school. He was already aware because they were there the day before too. What is the thing to do here? Like, I am part of Mothers Against Guns. Every time, a shooting happens, I'm part of the protests, but it's very hard to move the needle on this. So again, it's a continuation of the previous question as to what can I do in my small world to make a difference, because it's too daunting a task to make the bill change for it to make an impact.
I think we have to hold the industry accountable and our policymakers accountable. These are the same way illegal substances should not be circulating and easily available to young people in schools. These are products that we need to regulate and restrict access to because of the dangerousness. And so, I'm a community organizer at heart. I went to law school because I always said I wanted to know what to do if I or someone I knew was arrested during a protest, right? Of course, once you go to law school, the last thing you want to do is get arrested because you've invested a lot of time and money in becoming an attorney. But I think, civil disobedience, radical action that says we're not going to tolerate this anymore, this isn't how we want our children to be growing up. I mean, you travel around the world, and people are mystified about why Americans are willing to live with the level of violence that our children are being exposed to, just even in terms of training for risks. But I also want to point out the slide that I shared that children are more likely to be killed in their own home or by a family member. So school violence is an incredibly important and frightening phenomenon. This is real, even if sometimes it's a prank, but the reaction itself has trauma associated with it. And then you're having armed police officers in your educational environment. So remember that. My son, a friend of my son's was shot and killed by a police officer in Vallejo a few years ago, Sean Monterosa. There's violence associated with state intervention as well. And too many young people are afraid of or have directly experienced that kind of gun violence. So we have to say enough is enough and speak out in whatever way we can. And for some, that's going to be civil disobedience. For others, it's going to be fighting for policy changes, running for office. I encourage young people in this room to think about the difference you can make by being in a leadership position. And change policies. And then for anyone, I'm a big proponent of we all have a role to play. If you're just going to have conversations with people in your faith community, in your neighborhood, in your, when you play tennis, when you go to your club, whatever it is you do, have the conversation about this being a real issue. You shouldn't be afraid of hurting someone's feelings because we've got to be having the dialogue and saying enough is enough. So, I can't tell you what to do, when to keep your child or young person at home versus going to school, because this can happen at a concert or in other public settings. But I can encourage us all to be having the conversations and identifying ways to reduce risk, knowing the prevalence of firearms, and that we have to admit that we're living in a very violent country, even if the risk is still lower than what the press sometimes would suggest. So school violence, lots of reason to be concerned. Home violence, I'm very concerned about, and we have to take it all seriously and have the conversations that can reduce those risks.
Okay, I believe we have one final question.
Thank you. My question is for the youth panelists. First of all, I want to laud your to come on a Sunday afternoon to talk about something that we often not want to talk about. And I also laud everyone's families for allowing people, youth, to participate in this conversation, because that's what we're talking about today, right? Advocacy. But my question, and it sort of touches on what I think, Rahul, you mentioned in your speech, was about the various other causes that are directly linked also with the use of firearms and domestic violence. And I'm curious, I think both of you may be in different schools and different circles. Do you see these conversations come up frequently among your friends, your age group? Do you feel there's enough information or education on spotting red flags to become a little safer? May not just be about the homes, might be also about incidents that could happen in school. And it's a two-part question. So are there things that you would want the adult community, and this really relates back to what the previous questioner said, it takes time to change laws, and we have to continue to advocate, and with people like Julia, I think all of these things are going to be ongoing and very important. But what can we do for youth today by way of conversation, by way of education? So I'm sorry, it seemed like a long question. So one is, do you see enough conversations among your age group? And two, do you feel the need for adults or agencies to do anything about that?
So to answer your first question, I've never had like these deep conversations on this sort of topic with my friends, unless we are like going through a really hard time with personal life or like school life, where they are experiencing troubles with what is wrong and what is right. So I can't really delve into that topic of like how my friends see these like violence topics. So that I can't really talk about. But for adults, kind of what they can do, I feel like programs like these definitely like bring into light in teenagers and young adults like lives, and maybe like even talking to their parents and informing and enlightening their parents on these topics. So there's a lot of conservative parents out there who like refuse their kids from going out because of these precautions from the news, like, and especially like school shootings. So I feel like everyone should be enlightened, and these programs definitely help with them.
So for me, I also share the same thing. My friend circle, people I know, we don't commonly talk about this problem. And I think part of it is because it's become so normalized in the last 2 decades that it's been happening so much. We've sort of started treating it as this thing we want to pretend doesn't exist, because let's face it, we all have lives we want to carry on with, and we can't really keep thinking about things that depress us constantly, because we have to keep moving on with our lives. And it's a double-edged sword, because it allows us to keep moving on, but at the same time we seem to lose sight of that problem. And I think that discussion about it, to some limited degree, is something that we need to inject more into our young communities, because otherwise we begin to forget it's happening and stop treating it like the public health crisis that it is. And to the second part of your question, I think events like this are amazing for the youth community because it exposes us to the problem in a safe environment. I think also school counselors, people who are authorized to give young adolescents mental health advice, especially when they're going through tough times, those are crucial to prevent mass shootings and other crime. And I think in general, just education is the solution to this, because teaching people about what laws are out there, or mental health, red flags, and even responsible gun ownership and gun storage, I think it's important to educate youth so they can identify these problems so that they know what to expect and they don't forget the problem exists or try to normalize it, so that they're aware of the problem and specifics about it so they know how to diagnose it in themselves, in others, and help prevent it in their community. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, thank you everyone for your questions, and that concludes the Q&A segment of the session. I'd like to thank our wonderful keynote speaker and youth student panelists for their answers, so everyone please give one last round of applause. So now we'll transition into our open mic segment, where some of the community youth will share their thoughts, stories, insights on the topic of violence prevention. And while we do this, please enjoy some light refreshments in the back as we continue these conversations informally, and will foster a sense of community and collaboration as we work together to make more inclusive environments for all. And thank you for also attending the event. Please take our event survey. You can scan the QR code which will appear on the screen, or ask our volunteers for a paper survey. And it'll take a few seconds, but your input would help us out a lot. Thank you.
So please grab some refreshment, chips, cookies, or whatever you like from the backside, and then you come back and enjoy our open mic section.
Hello everyone, my name is Hajra, and I'm a volunteer at Maitri. I've been with them for about a year now, and I will be getting our open mic segment started. And then afterwards I'll pass it on to the rest of our open mic speakers. So, coming from a psychology background, I often tend to look at many social issues from a mental health perspective, and I know some of our speakers touched on this perspective as well. So through my education and work with Maitri, I've learned that all forms of violence can have profound negative impacts on individuals that witness or experience it. And the reverberating effect of gun violence is the development of psychological disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and substance abuse, among many more. This exposure and these mental health disorders can be particularly impactful on young people who are still developing both cognitively and emotionally. The rise of gun violence in the context of horrific school shootings and in domestic settings has given way to ample research showing us the consequences of exposure to violence on the mental health of adolescents. Unfortunately, I can recall personal experiences with gun violence in my own life and in the lives of my friends and family that affirmed my belief that guns have no place in our schools, communities, homes, and definitely not in our relationships as a tool of fear and harm. I remember taking my younger sister to funerals of her high school classmates whose lives were taken by gun violence. And I also remember the lasting impact it had on her, even though she did not witness the tragedy. It reminds me how far a reach violence has on those it touches. On a more hopeful note, the research has also shed light on various methods for healing on an individual level, on a community level, and on a larger level that involves our policymakers who can help us keep guns out of these environments that should be safe and nurturing. I urge you all to think about the instances of gun violence in the world around you and consider the many ways in which one senseless act caused adverse effects that continue to plague victims for years after. We as the youth of our society should focus our efforts on systemic change and building healthy relationships with each other by implementing trust, respect, and kindness in our actions. Dating relationships at a young age can expose us to violence, but speaking out against gun violence and accessing resources when we need help are a few ways for us to help end the cycle of violence. I'll now pass the mic over. I'd like to ask all our open mic speakers to please start by sharing your name and your school. Thank you.
We have one of the t-shirts. We last long beneath. It's okay. Yeah, we can have
Hi everyone, my name is Navanita Rane and I'm a junior at Evergreen Valley High School. The topic that I wanted to focus on today was something that was elaborated on by our keynote speakers, and that's the impact on gun violence on women and especially women of color in relation to domestic violence as well. So as mentioned before, women are disproportionately affected by gun violence when it's paired with domestic violence. And studies have shown that when firearms are present in situations of domestic violence, the risk of homicide for women increases dramatically. In fact, domestic violence incidents involving firearms are far more likely to result in the death of people compared to those involving other weapons or no weapons at all. Moreover, women of color, especially those coming from underfunded communities, face disproportionate levels of gun violence due to systemic oppression and lack of domestic violence resources. In fact, according to Giffords Law Center themselves, Black women make up 61% of gun-related homicides among women in total and are 5 times more likely to be killed compared to white counterparts. So what can we do to tackle these systemic issues? It all starts in our own communities with education and broadening communities' access to gun violence prevention resources and events like these. The impact on gun violence on women and especially women of color is especially profound, but by coming together and empowering these systemically oppressed neighborhoods, we can make America a little bit safer for everyone. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Sabrina Moore and I'm a current high school senior at Monte Vista in Cupertino, and I also volunteer with Students Demand Action. In 4th grade, minutes before the active shooter drill took place in my elementary school, I vividly remember my teacher speaking to the class about its significance, describing what was at stake if this were to be a real live situation. I remember envisioning myself doing all the things she told us, hiding quietly, running in a zigzag but non-consistent pattern as far as I could go, and always being aware of the nearest exit. Since then, I have never failed to notice all exits as soon as I enter a building. Now, I'll be the first to say that I have matured from my 4th grade self. However, as much as I have grown, the fear of a potential active shooter situation has unfortunately grown alongside me. From the time I was in elementary school to the time I started high school, the national gun violence rate doubled. Within 4 years, the chances of me and my peers dying to gun violence doubled. Through a study conducted by Georgia Tech on the long-term impacts of active shooter drills on students, teachers, and parents, they found that overall stress and anxiety increased by 42% and concerns over death increased by 22%, all within 90 days after the drill. Likewise, between 2015 and 2022, nearly 2 in 3 child victims of mass shootings died in incidents connected to domestic violence. As a student, sister, and aunt, the thought of allowing my younger brother, younger nieces, younger nephews, and future generations to enter a world and school system where their first priority is not learning while building up strong connections, but the thought of having to self-persevere themselves in the event of a situation involving firearms appalls me. And if you're here today, I'm sure you share the same sentiment. This being said, we must change the narrative of sending only thoughts and prayers, since quite frankly, they are no longer enough. It is imperative that we take action now. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Margaret Francor. I'm a senior at Monte Vista High School, and along with Sabrina, I volunteer with Students in Action. I hear recurrent conversation around my campus and in my community. I often hear people my age expressing their concern about an unjust subject, but then admitting that they feel there's nothing they can do about it. And I used to be somebody who held this mindset. Gun violence was always a problem I felt extremely strongly about, but felt incredibly paralyzed by the extent of the issue, and often thought to myself, what can a teenager do about such a large crisis? Now, almost 2 years into my advocacy with Students Demand Action, one of the most important things I have learned is that my age does not invalidate my effort, advocacy, and voice, but rather it is the youth voices that have a unique power to catalyze progress within our communities. As Students Demand Action, we have been inspired to take many important steps towards creating a safer place, whether it was conversing with politicians at the state capitol, where we were advocating for priority bills, one of which was AB 28 that Ms. Weber mentioned earlier, to organizing events at our school and community. Every action, no matter how small, makes an incredible difference. There's a common misconception that every action has to be huge or complicated, but I quickly learned what wonderful support systems we have in place to help guide us through our process. The message I want to convey today is that advocacy is extremely accessible. Passion resides within us for a reason, to make a difference and to push us to make our voices heard. I encourage you to reach out to your school's newspaper or write a statement for your morning announcements to educate other students on this pressing issue. You can start a group or get involved in groups that already exist and inform your communities about this issue. Action comes in many different shapes and sizes, but each one is an enormous step toward creating a world where we can feel safe and free of gun violence. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Olivia Rodriguez from Piedmont Hills High School, and I wrote a poem called Petals about the issue of domestic abuse and its intersection with gun violence, like we've been talking about all afternoon. It's so easy to get a guy who loves to have fun. Most abuse is private, it is legal. In the dream house, call it feudal. The past, the future, my mind's most painful removal. Because right now is my most personal hell, therewithal. So easy to get a way to keep the wound numb. Stuff it with flowers, fill me with false solistics and gentle probiotic prescriptions. Let me listen to your contradictions till I am nothing but petals and stitches. It's so easy to get a place to run, but not a way out. I keep every doubt. I have been manipulated, sometimes I've contemplated other escapes, but all of them end in death or rapes. My family has been threatened, so even on my deathbed, no, my future is not protected. This projection of your emotion, the superior infection that controls your hand, your mouth, till I am buried under the undergrowth. It is no mistake. The men, they fall, they break, disallowed from repair shops, the oil changed by the cops. They are more likely to get caught, except the times when they're not. Abuse of disabled and BIPOC are less reported when these violences are already hardly recorded. LGBTQ plus domestic abuse made silent, perfect partnerships expected, and the rest are disregarded. It's so easy to escape, find another man, his superhero flying cape. How will I know he won't do the same? How will I know it won't be so easy for him to get a 1 in 4 women, 1 in 7 men? Violence at the hands of the too quickly forgiven, of the trust is intimate, of every piece is given. Half of women killed are killed by a partner, half of those were shot at. God, I wish it was harder. It could be your daughter, your son, your loved one, you and me. So set the youth free and make it just a little bit harder to get a gun.
Hi, my name is Anya.
I attend Notre Dame San Jose High School. Sorry. The threat of guns and their misuse has consumed our lives. I can say that from experience. When I turn on the radio in the morning or listen to the news channel, as I'm sure many of us do as well, I hear countless stories about deaths from school shooters across our nation. In schools, in peace protests, in parks, everywhere. When I go to my own school, I'm constantly reciting the drills that we practiced and looking for escape routes. When I hear the alarm go off at my school, my immediate thought is that it must be a school shooter. Not a hazard, not a chemical leak, but a school shooter. This has become my new normal, and I'm sure in many ways you can relate to my experiences. We've become so accustomed to the idea of school shooters across our country taking the lives of others, from children to adults, that these newses and protocols don't quite faze us as much as they used to. The acceptance of this as a norm should make us realize that something must change. It's not possible for us to sit idly around and expect this problem to be resolved by itself. I believe that there should be comprehensive and community state level prevention programs in place to reduce access to guns. We must protect those who seem to risk their lives to get an education every day, who go to work every day, and for whom stepping outside of their house constitutes an act of bravery. We must stop this from becoming the new normal for generations to come and ensure that we are able to live our lives freely and without fear. Because these problems, if not addressed now, will play a much bigger role in your life, in the lives of your family, in the lives of your friends, and in the lives of your children than you may think. Now is the time for us to step out and speak out for ourselves and the people around us. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our open mic speakers. Everyone, please give them another round of applause. All right, so for this last segment, does anyone have any remaining questions they'd like to ask our panel? Okay, got it. Yeah, go for it.
I just want to say that to support the idea that gatherings like this make an enormous difference, I think the young people who spoke, both of you, each of you, and the open mic speakers, incredibly inspiring and moving. I wish you didn't have to use your energy to focus on this topic, but I'm grateful that you are in the work with us and speaking out and making a difference. It makes a huge difference. And like I said, I've been doing violence prevention work for 30 years, and I remain optimistic and inspired by people like you. So thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of today and for all the good work you're doing. It's incredibly impressive. So I look forward to being colleagues and watching and learning from you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. All right, last announcement. Please feel free to check out the refreshments in the bag, and a reminder to take our survey.
Does this event enhance your understanding of gun violence prevention?
I think it definitely did. Like, I didn't know anything about like
how the laws looked in like California about gun ownership, and also I think, like as mentioned, like the connection between domestic violence and like gun ownership is not that talked about. Like you see the like narrative of like school violence more often, I think. So I think that's definitely really important to bring up because I don't think about it. So I think this was really actually informative.
What was your key takeaway? What were your key takeaways from the event?
My key takeaways are on the power the youth has on our local environment, our neighborhoods, and what we can do as students and as parents to better improve our environment. There's a lot of like gun violence in my neighborhood, and so knowing like having this like seeing these people and stand up for their cause gives me a lot of reassurance in my community, and that's it.
Okay, thank you so much. What were your key takeaways from the event?
I think that this event really just emphasized the importance of strict gun laws and the intersectionality of domestic violence and gun violence, and how crucial it is for us to make sure that domestic abusers don't have access to firearms, because the combination of the two often leads to very fatal consequences. And I think as a society, we really need to implement stricter policies about just who has access to firearms.
Yeah. So what were your key takeaways from the event?
I am very encouraged to get a chance to listen to the young speakers here today. Some of them were really, really inspiring, and their stories were resonating. And I just think that forums like these is what maybe it's the step that we can take, to kind of bring more understanding and kind of deal with the stresses of gun violence and what it means to the young kids.
What were your key takeaways from the session?
Key takeaways from the session. I think the best thing I like about this session was the youth participation, basically participating into the conversation. We have had this conversation at home with our friends, and I am on the person basically on these topics, which is completely on the opposite spectrum. Opposite spectrum means it doesn't believe in let's say if you take this topic particularly, I don't see a reasoning behind owning a gun, first of all, or any kind of firearm, or any kind of violent tool, basically, right? So I'm surrounded by the people who are actually believe in the same thing. So it's like a one-sided conversation happens, right?
Okay.
So when you come into this kind of discussions, you hear the other. I'm hoping to hear the other side of the coin.
Side of the story. Yeah.
So that was interesting, and the best thing I like about it is the kids, and these kids are coming in and they're talking about and they're trying to understand the other side of the information,
yes,
the perspective from the other party. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I feel like I learned a lot from both the keynote speakers and the open mic speakers, because they talked a lot about how it's so prevalent in society, and especially the keynote speaker explained how guns are they've been promoted as self-defense and only used in a positive light sometimes, where it also really consumed our society of it being negative, and there needs to be a way to prevent the issues.